Today we're going to look at one of the most important theories in normative ethics, consequentialism. According to consequentialism, an action is morally right just because it maximizes the amount of good in the world. Now, if you think about the title, consequentialism, it immediately gives you a clue with regard to the nature of this theory. According to this theory, what gives our actions their moral value are the effects or consequences of the action. So an action is right because it has the effect of maximizing the amount of good in the world. Let's take a closer look at this theory. Consequentialism argues that optimific actions are good. So let's begin there. What is an optimific action? We can define an optimific action in the following way. An action is optimific if it produces the greatest overall balance of good to bad effects. So, an action is optimific if in that situation, that action is the best possible action of all actions that you could perform. In other words, given all of the actions that are available to you in that particular moment, the action that produces the greatest possible ratio or balance of good to bad effects is going to be the optimific action. So let me illustrate with an example. Imagine I can either donate $300 to famine prevention, or I can buy myself a new iPhone. What should I do? If I buy the iPhone, then I am made happy, but 10 people, say, would die of starvation. If I donate the money, then those people will not die, but I won't be as happy as I would have been if I had purchased the iPhone for myself. Which of these two actions is optimific? Purchasing myself the new iPhone or donating that money to famine relief? Well, clearly, the optimific action in this situation is to donate the money to famine relief. And we can, in fact, mathematize this to a certain extent. If I buy myself the iPhone, then there is one good consequence, namely, I am made happy, but there are 10 bad consequences. 10 people are made unhappy. So the ratio of good to bad results is 1 to 10. If I donate that money to famine relief, then there are 10 good consequences, but there is one bad consequence, namely my unhappiness for not having the iPhone. So the ratio of good to bad effects there is 10 to 1. 10 to 1 is clearly a higher ratio than 1 to 10. Therefore, I should donate that money. So according to the consequentialist, we should be aiming for optimific actions. Whenever we act, we should ask ourselves, what are the actions available to us, and which of those actions or set of actions is going to be optimific? So here's the structure of consequentialism. First, we need to figure out what has intrinsic value. In other words, we need to do value theory, because consequentialism doesn't tell us what feature of the consequences of our actions matters. It just tells us we should be looking at the consequences of our actions. But it doesn't tell us which feature of those consequences is the one that is morally relevant. So, if, for example, we figure out that happiness has intrinsic value, then consequentialism will tell us that the optimific course of action is the one that maximizes happiness. 2, we then have to figure out what is intrinsically bad. So let's say happiness is intrinsically good, then unhappiness is intrinsically bad. So now we have a way of calculating the consequences of our actions. We want to produce those actions that will maximize the good effects, namely happiness, and that won't produce the bad effects, namely unhappiness. Now, let me just say something here before we look at the rest of the structure of consequentialism. What consequentialism highlights, I think, is that human action isn't as simple as we like to think of it. In other words, consequentialism recognizes that we make trade-offs all the time when we perform actions. There are no purely good actions. All actions will have some good and some bad effects. And this is, I think, something important to remember, because something that I think moral philosophy in general is going to teach us is that human action is complicated, and that complexity of human action will sometimes make it difficult for us to determine how we ought act, and difficult for us to know whether our action is in fact a good one or not. And this is something we'll discuss in a moment. 3, figure out what actions are available to you in the moment. 4, determine what the value of the results of each action will be. So once I figure out all of the actions that are available to me, I then have to calculate the ratio of good to bad effects. Finally, choose the action that has the highest ratio of good to bad results. That action is optimific. So what are the features of consequentialism? Well, the main feature is that consequentialism asks that we maximize goodness. In other words, the theory is telling us that when we perform actions, we should be aiming to generate as much goodness as we can. Now, for the remainder of our discussion of consequentialism, we're going to look at one particular consequentialist theory. Act utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory that's based on the greatest happiness principle, aka the principle of utility. So act utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory that argues that happiness is an intrinsic good. And so when we are performing actions, we should be aiming to promote happiness. So, what is the principle of utility? The principle of utility, aka the principle of happiness, tells us that an action is right to the extent that it produces the greatest overall amount of happiness. And an action is wrong to the extent that it decreases the overall amount of happiness. So, according to act utilitarianism, we ought, when we are performing an action, calculate the happy to unhappy results and perform the action that has the highest ratio of happy to unhappy results. Now, this theory is often misunderstood, and let me try to dispel a couple of misunderstandings of this theory. First, when we're deciding how to act, we do not have to perform the action that benefits the greatest number of people. Why? Well, let me just illustrate with a very simple example. Imagine I have $10,000 to distribute, and I can give 10,000 people $1 each. Or I can give a single mother of 2 that is working 3 jobs the $10,000. Well, the optimific course of action in that case would be to give the single mother the $10,000, even though I could benefit 10,000 people by giving each of them $1. The point here, of course, is that the $1 is not going to be a great benefit to any one person, whereas the $10,000 is going to be a huge benefit to the single mother. A second common misunderstanding is that the principle of utility requires that we choose an action that will generate the greatest amount of happiness. Now, this too is false. Remember, we defined an optimific action as an action that has the greatest balance of good to bad effects. So, to illustrate what's the problem here, imagine I have two available actions. One is to make 10 people happy and one person unhappy. So imagine that's my first option, that if I perform action A, I will make 10 people happy and one person unhappy. And imagine there's another action available to me, action B, which if I perform will result in 1,000,000 happy people, but will also result in 1,000,000 unhappy people. Now, even though the second action will benefit a greater number of people, the ratio of good to bad results of the second action is 1-to-1, whereas the ratio of good to bad results in the action A is 10-to-1. So really, I should perform the first action. In other words, I should perform the action that benefits a fewer number of people. Why? Because the ratio is in the favor of happiness in the first case. Whereas in the second case, even though, yeah, I'm making 1,000,000 people happy, I'm also making 1,000,000 people unhappy. So I haven't actually produced a net balance of happiness. But I have done so in the first case. 2, moral knowledge. If consequentialism is correct, and in particular, if act utilitarianism is correct, so if the rightness of an action depends upon its results, how can we know before we see the consequences of our actions whether they will be optimific? In other words, how can we know before we act what course of action we ought to take? So the issue is this. According to the consequentialist, I can only guess before I perform the action whether my action is going to in fact be optimific. In other words, the consequences of my action occur after I perform the action. And so I cannot know before I perform the action, and when I'm deciding how to act, what the actual consequences will be. So the question is this: can we have moral knowledge? Can we know whether our actions are right or wrong? And if we can, how can we? Now, act utilitarians are divided on this issue. There are two possible sort of responses here. According to the first response, it's the actual results of our actions that determine whether the action is right or wrong. But since the actual results of an action cannot be known beforehand, I might be able to predict, I might be able to guess, and in fact that's what you do. You guess, okay, if I perform this action, it'll be better than I perform that action. But because the actual results of an action cannot be known beforehand, and in fact may never be known even after the action is performed. Why is that the case? Well, there may be effects to our actions that are either local but not visible to us. In other words, there may be some effects of the actions that we perform that for whatever reason we may never be aware of. For example, let's say I give $10 to someone who is begging for change on the street. And I walk away and I never see that person again. That person, an hour later, goes and, say, buys some drugs and dies of an overdose. Now, according to ACT utilitarianism, my action was a bad one because it resulted in their death. But I am never going to discover that. I never see that person again, and so on. So, the action may have local consequences, but those consequences are unknown to us. The action may have more far-reaching consequences, though, both spatially and temporally. We may perform actions whose consequences continue to reverberate into the future, past our deaths. Right? We may perform an action which has long-term effects, and we might die before all of those effects are actually produced. And so we may, in that situation, never have moral knowledge with regard to our actions. And this is a very sobering thought. We often think that we are in a position to know whether we've led good lives or not. But we may not be in that position. We may have imperfect knowledge with regard to how good our lives were. Or we may never, in fact, know at all whether our lives were good at all, or to what degree our lives were good. Why? Because the actual results of our actions continue to reverberate into the future. Here's an example. If you're a parent, then you perform all sorts of actions that make the life of your child, possible. Now, after you die, your child is going to produce all sorts of actions. And your child may produce actions that turn out to have really horrible consequences. Well, those consequences, in a sense, can be traced back to you and your life. Why? Because you gave birth to the child, you raised the child, you educated the child, etc. And this is one way, for example, in which we can use to distinguish a great life from an average life. A great life is one whose consequences continue to reverberate into the future. Now, by great, I don't mean a good life. I just mean a life that was big in some sense, that had far-reaching consequences. Let me just give you an example, right? The life of Jesus Christ is one that produced consequences that we have yet to see, right? The life of Jesus Christ gave birth to a religion called Christianity. And Christianity is a religion that is still active today and will continue to be active in the future. And so the effects of Jesus's life have yet to be fully realized. And so there's a sense in which we, at this point, don't really know what the net balance of effects might be from Jesus's life or Napoleon's life, and so on. So big, great lives produce effects that reverberate far into the future. But even average lives do so, as my example with the parent and the child illustrates. So if it's the actual results that matter with regard to moral knowledge, then we may have imperfect knowledge at best with regard to how good our actions are and how good our lives are. Now, some utilitarians want to say it's the expected results that matter, not the actual results. And if that's the case, then moral knowledge is possible. In other words, you can know whether your life was a good one. Why? Because you know what you expected would be the results of your actions. But most utilitarians will reject B as a response. Why? because the core of the theory states that what makes an action actually right are the actual consequences. And so really the answer has to be A, that it's the actual results of the action that matter in determining the rightness of the action. But the actual results are things that we may have only imperfect knowledge of at best. Another interesting feature of this theory is that it assesses actions and intentions separately. In other words, we can give an account of the intentions that a person has for performing an action separately from the actual results of the action. And this is actually quite useful and I think important. For there are many cases where someone has good intentions, but they actually produce bad actions. Right? You know the old phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And there are also instances where someone has bad intentions, but produces good results. So let me just give you a couple of examples, silly examples to illustrate this. Imagine I'm a dictator of some country, and there's a certain portion of the population that's rebelling against my dictatorship. And I think to myself, I'm going to crush the rebellion. So I send my bombers to go bomb that part of the country. But unbeknownst to me and the pilots of the bombers, instead of bombs, the cargo hold is filled with food and supplies, medical supplies and, say, food. And so instead of bombing those people, I actually drop food and medical supplies. So what do we say about that action? Now, it would be wrong to say that my action was a bad one. Clearly it wasn't bad because now these people have food and they have medical supplies and so on. But you also don't want to say that I am a good person. Well, consequentialism shows us that we can evaluate those two things separately. We can say my action was a good one, but my intention was bad. So I'm a bad person in the sense that I have this bad intention, but I produced a good action. Or to give you a different example, imagine I'm an assassin and I've been hired to assassinate some important public figure, and I pull the trigger and the bullet ricochets, it misses its target and it ricochets around the room and it hits me in the head and I die. Well, there's an example of an action that had a good consequence. Why? Because it killed an assassin. But the intention for performing the action was a bad one. So I am bad insofar as I had that bad intention, but my action was a good one. Now, I'll give you an example of the opposite case. Imagine I see a child unattended standing by the swimming pool. And I run over to the child thinking, well, there's nobody there, and if I don't run over to the child might fall into the pool and drown. So my intention is good. But as I'm running over, I slip, and I actually knock the child into the pool, and the child drowns. Well, what do we say about a situation like that? We don't want to say the action was good. Clearly, the action was not good. It was a bad action. Why? Because it resulted in the death of the child. But we also don't want to say that I'm a bad person. This theory can explain this. We can judge my intention separately. We can say my intention was a good one, but my action was bad. So, the attractions of act utilitarianism specifically are the following. One, the theory is impartial. What does this mean? Well, the theory says that we should treat everybody as a potential source of happiness, and we should treat everyone equally. In other words, we can't prioritize some people over others. Rather, everyone is equally valuable with regard for our ability to experience happiness. So the theory demands that we take everyone who can be affected by our action into consideration when deciding how to act. right? If I'm deciding how to spend my money and I want to buy myself the new iPhone, I have to ask myself, well, who else is impacted by that decision? Well, if I buy myself that new iPhone, then there are 10 people, let's say, who would die, who would otherwise not die if I donated that money. So the theory requires that we recognize that everybody is a source of happiness, let's say, and thus we have to consider how our actions will have an impact on everyone equally. In other words, the theory does not say, unlike ethical egoism, which we saw last lecture, that my happiness is more important than the happiness of others. No, everyone's happiness is worth an equal amount. 2, it justifies conventional moral wisdom. The idea here is, if we think about our conventional morality, why is it that we consider actions like lying and stealing and cheating wrong, and other actions like being kind and considerate and helping those in need right? Well, it seems like what really matters are the effects or consequences of those actions. Lying is bad, why? Because it harms people. Stealing is bad, why? Because it harms people, and so on. In other words, it's the effects of those actions that make those actions wrong, and it's the effects of good actions that make those actions right. Act utilitarianism and consequentialism in general can explain why that's the case. 3, it provides a framework for conflict resolution. Imagine that there are 2 people or 2 groups of people who stand in some sort of conflict. Well, act utilitarianism can provide a way out of that conflict, right? We can ask both people, both groups of people, what is it that you value? And let's say they both value happiness. We can then ask, okay, what actions or what policies should we enact such that we can maximize the amount of happiness? Whatever that policy ends up being will be the resolution of the conflict. Should our 2 nations continue to be at war, or should our 2 nations continue to be produce a lasting peace, let's say? Well, clearly a lasting peace is going to produce a greater amount of happiness than perpetual warfare. Therefore, we should try to enact a set of policies that will generate a lasting peace. In other words, we're looking at the consequences or the effects of the policies that we choose, and in the case of a conflict, we should be looking for policies that will eliminate that conflict. This is, by the way, the basic rational framework that secretaries of state have been using for the past 3 or 4 decades to try to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. 4, moral rule flexibility. If act utilitarianism is right, then there really are no strict or absolute moral rules. Why? Because strict and absolute moral rules won't always generate the optimific course of action. Just to give you an example, imagine we had the rule, do not kill anyone. So imagine we had a rule that forbade killing. Absolutely. Well, clearly that would not be a good moral rule if consequentialism was true. Here's why. Imagine by killing one person, say Adolf Hitler, I can save 6 million people. Well, in that case, killing clearly is the optimific course of action. So, no matter what the rule is, we can always imagine a scenario where the violation of the rule would generate the optimific course of action. If that was the case, then there are no true, absolute, or inflexible moral rules. And 5, it expands the scope of the moral community. If act utilitarianism is right, then some individual is a member of the moral community insofar as they have the capacity for suffering, in other words, experiencing pain, or the capacity for experiencing pleasure. Now, if you think about it, what other kinds of things in the universe besides human beings can experience pain and pleasure? Well, clearly non-human animals. If act utilitarianism is right, then the moral community would include not only human beings, but also dogs and cats and pigs and cows, giraffes and elephants, etc. In other words, anything that is sentient, anything that can experience pain or pleasure. Now, what are some problems for act consequentialism? Well, the first problem is how to measure value. And we talked about this a little bit when we looked at hedonism. How exactly do we A, measure, and B, compare happiness levels? One action that makes one person happy may make another person unhappy, and so on. So we need to figure out some way to measure. Now, I think the act consequentialist or the act utilitarian will say, well, the measurements may not be precise, but nonetheless, we can make some measurements. 2, how do we decide what values to endorse? So again, this is a question primarily for value theory. Is it happiness that matters, or is it justice that matters, or is it knowledge that matters? How do we figure out what values to endorse? So those two problems are general problems about value. The third problem, though, is a pretty serious problem related directly to act consequentialism. And the objection is this: act consequentialism or act utilitarianism is overly demanding. And it's overly demanding in 3 spheres. The first one is deliberation. If act utilitarianism is right, or if any consequentialist theory is right, we need to calculate all of the factors that govern the particular situation that we're in order to determine whether an action is optimific or not. But there are simply too many factors to consider when we are deliberating. Remember, what we have to do is stop and ask ourselves, okay, what are all the actions that are available to us in the moment? And after we answer that question, and think about this for a second, given any action that you can perform, there are going to be hundreds and hundreds of alternative actions that you could have performed. So you have to first list all of those actions, so to speak. And then second, you have to calculate all of their possible consequences. Well, this seems to be overly demanding. Here's one reason why it's overly demanding. Sometimes there is a temporal constraint on our action. In other words, we need to decide within the next 30 seconds whether we perform action A or action B. Just to give you an example, there's a famous case of an individual who was in the New York City subway system, and he was standing on the platform, and he saw another man pass out and fall into the tracks. And he looked down the tunnel, and he saw that a train was coming into the station. So he had less than 15 seconds to decide what to do. This man actually jumped into the tracks and held down the person who had fallen into the tracks. And the reason why he held him down is because he knew that there was enough clearance underneath the train that the train could just pass right over them. And in fact, this is what happened. A truly heroic and shocking action. But clearly, if this person was a consequentialist, he would never have performed that action because there wouldn't have been enough time for him to calculate all of the possible consequences of the action. So it's too demanding in the sense that it demands that we take into consideration too many factors. B, it's overly demanding with regard to motivation. Isn't it true that if act utilitarianism is right, that only a saint could live according to this theory? And let me explain why. Remember that according to act utilitarianism, we should only perform the action that is optimific. In other words, we need to maximize the amount of goodness, in this case, the amount of happiness, by our action. But now, think about this scenario. Imagine you're walking through the park, and imagine there are two pools equidistant from you. And in one of the pools there are, say, two children drowning. So in one of the pools, there's two children drowning, and you don't know who those children are. They're strangers to you. And imagine in the other pool that is equidistant from you, your little brother or sister is drowning. Now think about this for a second. If act utilitarianism is right, and you can only save one group, either the two children or your little sibling, who should you save? Well, you should save the two stranger children. Why? Well, it's two children compared to one. In other words, the optimific course of action in that case is to save those two children. But isn't it true that only a saint would be able to do something like that? In other words, isn't it true that we cannot or should not have to be motivated in that kind of way? And C, action. If act consequentialism is true, then there is no difference between a regular moral duty and a supererogatory moral duty. So what's the difference between a regular duty and a supererogatory duty? Well, a supererogatory moral duty is a duty which, if you perform, you are praised for it, and the action that you perform is considered a good action. But if you fail to perform it, you are not criticized for failing to perform it, and whatever action you perform instead is not thereby considered a wrong action. A regular duty, though, is one which, if you fail to perform it, then you have done something wrong. So let me give you an example. In our society, donating to charity is considered a supererogatory duty. In other words, if you donate to charity, then we think you have done something right. But if you don't donate to charity, we don't think that you have done something wrong. But imagine you promise to pay back a debt. Well, in our society, if you fail to pay back the debt, then we do think you have done something wrong. Okay, according to act utilitarianism, or act consequentialism, there is no difference between regular and supererogatory duties, right? All duties would be regular duties. So, if you have some extra money and you want to take yourself to the movies, according to the act utilitarianism, it would be wrong for you to take yourself to the movies. Why? Because you could instead donate that money to Oxfam, let's say, and save the life of a child. And what's more optimific? That you enjoy a movie for 2 hours, or that a child's life is saved? Clearly, that a child's life is saved. Now, the criticism here is that this theory is too demanding to the point that it violates that old saying that ought implies can. In other words, this theory is demanding of us things that we couldn't possibly live up to. we're not saints. We're not gods in the sense that we could take into consideration every little bit of information that's relevant for the action, or that we could be motivated purely by benevolence, purely by the welfare of all human beings, or that we can plausibly always perform what we now consider to be supererogatory duties. But I think the act utilitarianism will respond by saying, well, we can do these things. In other words, it is possible for us to try to take into consideration every bit of information governing a situation, that we can be motivated by universal human happiness, and that we can change our actions such that they reflect this motivation for universal human happiness. 4. Sometimes moral action requires partiality. So this is the swimming pool example that I just gave you, but now I'll give you a different example that's, I think, even more illustrative. Imagine your child needs to have an operation that will save your child's life. And imagine the operation costs $200,000. What should you do? Pay the $200,000 and save the life of your child, or donate the $200,000 to a charity that will be able to save the lives of 100 children. Now, if act utilitarianism is true, you should let your child die and save the lives of 100 children. But if you did that, wouldn't we have some reason to think that you in fact did do something wrong? In other words, isn't it true that human beings are the kinds of creatures that in order to be good human beings, we do need to treat some people as having a greater value than others, namely our children, our parents, our brothers and sisters, our friends? Isn't it true that what it means to be a good human being is to be a good friend? But isn't it true that to be a good friend, you have to distinguish between friends and strangers? You have to treat some people as having greater value than others, just as we do with our children. Isn't it true that what it means to be a good parent is that you treat your children as being more valuable than others? In other words, you provide them with all sorts of resources, education, food, clothing, love, that you don't provide other children. 5. Act utilitarianism could demand actions that are unjust. In other words, the theory requires that we forego rights and duties, that we actually forego justice. How so? Well, according to the act utilitarian, an action is right if it has the best overall consequences. But sometimes the best overall consequences could actually be the products of unjust actions. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is a real-world example. So in the South, prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and even after, there would be scenarios in which a crime was committed in a small town, and the sheriff of the town would investigate the crime, but they wouldn't be able to find enough evidence to convict someone. And the town would threaten to riot if someone wasn't punished for the crime. Because the town was racist, the sheriff would randomly concoct evidence and frame a person of color for the crime. And then the person of color would either go to prison or be executed for the crime. But the result of this action would be that the town would not riot. Now, if act utilitarianism is true, it does seem that what the sheriff does is in fact right. Why? Well, by convicting an innocent person, by framing an innocent person, the sheriff was able to prevent a larger catastrophe, namely the rioting of the town, which probably would have resulted in multiple other deaths. But isn't it true that the sheriff's action was in fact a deeply immoral action? And it was immoral because it violated basic principles of justice. We as individuals have a right not to be falsely convicted of a crime that we didn't commit, but in this case, the sheriff violated that right. So let me give you another example. This is a purely fictional example. Imagine that there's a group of people who all despise one particular individual in the group. And imagine that the group would be made extremely happy if we tortured that individual. Well, according to act utilitarianism, it would be right to torture that individual. But isn't it true that torturing the individual would have been deeply unfair and unjust? Now, one possible solution to these problems is a theory called rule consequentialism. For example, rule utilitarianism. According to rule utilitarianism, an action is right if it is a product of an optimific social rule. Now, what does it mean to say that a rule is optimific in a social sense? Well, an optimific social rule is one which, if everyone in the society adopted, the best possible results would be produced. Another way of thinking about rule consequentialism is in the following way: that when we decide how to act, we should base the rightness or wrongness of our action not on the actual effects produced, not on the actual consequences, but on a rule that in the past has had the best possible results. So let's look at a couple of examples to illustrate this. As a general rule, the prohibition on lying is a good thing. In other words, as a rule, the best possible results are usually produced by telling the truth. And if everyone in society followed that rule, then generally we would have the best possible results. Or to give a different example, as a general rule, a system of principles that preserves the basic values of justice has the best possible effects. So, as a rule, if we don't falsely accuse and convict people of crimes that they didn't commit, we get the best possible results. Now, this does, in a sense, solve the problem of justice. That we could produce a theory according to which following a rule is going to have the best possible results. But another problem is generated. Namely, that there are instances where following the rule is going to be less optimific. So as a general rule, sure, the prohibition on lying is good. In other words, the prohibition on lying does generate the best possible results usually. But what if the person who's at my door and who is holding an axe asks me where my family is? Well, in that particular instance, if I were to follow the rule, do not lie, and I told the person where my family was, the actual effects would in fact not be optimific. And so this theory then is, in an important sense, an irrational theory. Why? Because it tells me that I should tell the axe murderer where my family is, even though telling the axe murderer where my family is not going to produce the optimific result. So, rule consequentialism, even though it may solve the problem of justice, in the end is an irrational theory because it violates the basic principle that's central to consequentialism, namely that we should produce actions and determine how good those actions are by reference to the consequences or effects of the action.